Urgent! Trump's peace plan was written in the Kremlin, not in the White House. I
think we are very close to a deal.
Zelensky is ready to end the war in 2 days.
The terrible red lines have been trampled. Kiev has made concessions.
The Kremlin is backing down. Putin wants to fight and kill forever.
And overall, that really suits us well for our purposes.
Trump is sending Whitcoff to Putin.
He will arrive in Moscow next week. And
is no longer giving any deadlines for making peace. For me, the deadline is when it's all over. But what about the Turkey and Thanksgiving on the 27th? Unconditionally order. Erdogan enters the game. The nasty little Putin won't have it easy.
Erdogan publicly humiliated Russia. During his meeting with Zelensky, he said exactly what the Kremlin was afraid to hear. Crimea is Ukraine.
Was he drunk or not? The press lush Zakharova tried to prove she doesn't drink.
At this point, we've seen it all. Apparently, they just can't find it. And now they've come up with something.
A new scandal, friends, that absolutely everyone is talking about. Trump's peace plan wasn't written in the White House, but in the Kremlin. Transcripts have surfaced of negotiations between Stephen Whitcoff and Yuri Ushakov, Putin's aide, where you can hear how Whitcoff directly explains how to behave with Grandpa Donny. Is she working for the Kremlin, Trump's closest friend, or are they just hoping this will end the war? We'll get to the bottom of this, but it really is a sensation. Besides that, we'll talk about how the Kremlin is backtracking. It seems the plan has fallen through. Peskov states that it's premature to talk about a peace plan right now, about ending the war. Trump himself is echoing the Kremlin. The owner of Navalny's office says he never set any deadlines for signing a peace agreement. And as for the American Thanksgiving on November 27th, he simply suggests everyone forget about it. And overall, we understand that no meeting between him, Zelensky, and Putin is on the horizon. This is what the story is about, the most insane and important events of the day in international affairs. Afterward, I'll be waiting for you in the studio for discussion.
China is betraying Russia. Yes, you heard that right. Beijing masterfully pretends to be a partner, but in reality, it uses Moscow as the weak link. And
in our language, there's a phrase that has become a saying. Russians and Chinese are brothers forever.
But here's what's interesting. Recently, Xi spoke on the phone with Trump and stated that he supports the US peace effort regarding the resolution of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It sounds nice in words, but what about in practice?
I think that China has sent a political signal to the United States, indicating that it is closely watching what is happening in terms of the peace process and the search for peaceful solutions in the Russia-Ukraine war. The central and most important point of this signal should be that Russia must not win this war, and accordingly Ukraine must not lose.
But here's something else. The leaders of the countries have agreed on visits, and Trump is planning to go to China as early as April.
Whether Trump will be able to reach the desired trade agreement with China, specifically in April, for example, during a potential meeting in Beijing, is a big question. As for anything deeper, especially regarding the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, within these timeframes, April 2026, a meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump in Beijing is not on the table.
But what exactly is China doing wrong in relation to Russia? It seems like everything is fine. The thing is, China is making a lot of money off Russia. The prices of export goods supplied to Russia have increased by an average of 87%.
Russia's relationship with China has always been very complicated. And if we think they're friends, no, there's actually a good word for it. They're fellow travelers. Russia and China are fellow travelers. It's in China's interest for Russia to be weak, for Putin to be weak, for China to buy raw materials cheaply, and then to sell goods to the Russian Federation at very high prices. Russia, for the most part, has no other way out anymore. And
it's not just about goods. China is gradually moving into Russian regions, thereby gaining access to territories and resources.
You know, there are already examples in the Far East where small settlements have become predominantly Chinese, and now they're even participating in municipal elections there.
Russia, in turn, is becoming increasingly dependent on China. And
is Putin okay with this kind of relationship? Again, well, of course not. Of course he isn't. Because Putin has phantom pains about the Soviet Union, basically. Throughout his entire presidency, He has tried to restore some kind of white greatness, as he calls it, the gathering of Russian lands. But in reality, he is simply leading the Russian Federation to collapse, to complete and utter ruin, to financial bankruptcy.
Beijing is increasingly strengthening its influence in Central Asia while pushing Moscow to the background, which most probably cannot help but worry the aging leader in the halls of power in the Kremlin. Let me ask you this. Here's the main question that we need to consider. What are the key motivations, historical influences, and strategic interests that are truly driving China's actions and decisions in the modern world? How do its economic ambitions, political priorities, and cultural values shape the direction China is taking on the global stage today? A true partnership with...
Is it Russia, perhaps?
The communication reflects the strategic nature of Russian-Chinese relations, which are at an unprecedentedly high level.
Or is Beijing simply taking advantage of the situation and acting in its own interests?
They are not interested in the Russian Federation winning this war. Because if Putin wins this war, then he restores his geopolitical agency. He starts talking to all the actors, for example, with the United States and China themselves on an equal footing, which is absolutely not in line with China's strategic interests. Yes, this position is covert.
China talks about friendship, but only acts when it benefits them. It profits from Russia, strengthens its own influence, and at the same time builds relations with the US. And Moscow is becoming increasingly dependent on Beijing's decisions.
Vyacheslav Maltsev, chairman of the National Committee for the Fight Against Putin, is joining our broadcast. Vyacheslav, hello, we're glad to see you. Hello. So what do you think about these so-called tapes of Whitcoff and Ushakov? Because on the one hand, it was already pretty clear that Whitcoff was being sent to the Kremlin not to showcase his brilliant abilities, but because he knows how to convey the necessary position to Trump. He knows how to work with the American president and perfectly reports everything Putin wants straight into his ear. But now it's come down to actual recommendations, like, say this to Trump and you'll get that. How are we supposed to interpret all this? Is this all heading in the direction of a red agent or not? Or will there be some kind of stop to all this, craziness?
Let's start with the fact that the document was written in Moscow. That was obvious. And what I like most is that the Americans figured out that there were Russian idiomatic expressions in it, and it was just a direct, literal translation. But for some reason, none of these Americans noticed that the 100-day period is a purely Russian time frame. It is specified in the Russian Constitution. Nowhere in the West, in any legal act, does it exist. The concept of 100 days, except in the Russian Constitution, it's so obvious, and yet for some reason it wasn't obvious to everyone else. When I read it, I laughed a lot because it was clear who wrote it, that it was written in the Kremlin by people who know the chapter of the Russian Constitution about the president of the Russian Federation very well and understand what 100 days means. That's why this number appeared there. As for the conversation between Whitcoff and Ushakov, well, it's absolutely obvious that all conversations between Whitcoff and Ushakov are like that. But as you understand, he mainly talks with Dmitriev, and those conversations are completely different. And it was precisely this information that didn't leak out. Why didn't it leak? Because it's information about money. And because, interestingly enough, both sides are interested in keeping this information secret. But keeping this information secret was only of interest to Whitcoff, while Ushakov had absolutely no interest in keeping it secret. On the contrary, it was even beneficial for him to leak it. Most likely they did leak it because it was clear that he had prepared for the conversation, which was supposed to become public. In other words, if Whitcoff wasn't prepared for this conversation to go public, Ushakov was. So this is just a typical classic setup, a KGB-style move. The leak happened, it went out through WhatsApp or in some other way. Some people might believe that, and I think you see the whole situation is as follows. Here's what's happening at the moment. There's Trump, who really enjoys getting money, working with money, and playing golf. Everything else bores him terribly. He's not interested. And then there's this war in Ukraine. He's very concerned that huge amounts of US money have gone to Ukraine, and it's unclear where exactly. There's corruption in Ukraine, as you know yourself. When I was asked a long time ago, a year or two back, how Zelensky could defeat Russia, I said to do that, you simply need to defeat corruption in Ukraine. And then Russia would basically be flat on its back. If you don't defeat corruption in Ukraine, there will be big problems. And now those problems have started. As I understand it, the Americans, in order to force Zelensky to sign whatever they want, approached from the angle of the funds they provided and asked where that money went. Obviously, part of those funds, how much, I don't know, but I can guess, I assume, went in a well-known direction, right? And the Americans, with their own resources, with the resources of the Treasury Department, can easily track this. So they can influence, not only for these reasons, but here they can exert serious pressure on the authorities in Ukraine. And that's why Putin, who writes these kinds of notes from 28 folders, he sends them to Trump, yes, and basically, what is he counting on? On the same thing he has always counted on. When Trump, more than a year ago, said he would end the war in a single day, like Trump said, he won't stop, maybe he'll listen to me, I'll talk to Putin, then we'll talk to Zelensky, and the war will end. So he was counting on calling Putin and saying, Vova, tell me what needs to be done to stop the war. He'll say, here, we're sending you 28 points. He passes them on to Zelensky and says, look, here are 28 points, make sure they're fulfilled and the war will end. And that's it. That's how Trump saw ending the war, no other way, believe me. And when Zelensky got stubborn, of course, he got really angry. And I think that the American intelligence agencies, including and the financial ones, the Treasury Department, worked very thoroughly to prepare for this moment. That's why there is reason to believe that Zelensky is now under incredible pressure. Whether he'll withstand it or not, I don't know. It really depends on what kind of materials they're presenting to him and how much he is a strong-willed person, but judging by what happened in the first days of the war and afterwards, he is quite a strong-willed person, so we'll see. I'm ready to wish him luck, but right now it's clear that Putin is, let's say, playing the leading role in this idea, specifically during this period of negotiations. That's absolutely obvious, and he has handled everything very precisely from the perspective of the intelligence services and journalists, including the leak of this information. And as for Trump, he's basically in a state where he's more interested in dealing with China than with the war in Ukraine.
Vyacheslav, nevertheless, it's interesting that Trump wrote that he is ready to meet with Putin and Zelensky only if there is some kind of finalization of this agreement. And right now, in the American establishment, there is incredible criticism of Whitcoff and accordingly of Trump as well, for essentially sending a person who, according to many congressmen, is almost a Russian agent, and wants to build some further plans based on this. In other words, the Kremlin's plan isn't working. They wanted all of this to happen quietly, but now it has already become public knowledge. Now absolutely everyone will use this against Trump.
His opponents didn't want it to happen quietly either. In fact, when you look at their everyday lives, you can see that they often want things to work out in their favor, but they prefer these outcomes to happen without any noise or unnecessary attention. They tend to seek situations where the results benefit them, but everything unfolds smoothly and quietly without drawing notice or causing a stir. That's exactly how it was. Everything related to money and so on. As I told you, it's not for nothing. The conversation with Dmitriev didn't leak anywhere. Dmitriev handles financial matters. Whitcoff is Trump's financial lawyer. Why didn't the conversations with Dmitriev leak? Because they were about finances. But these conversations did leak. And it's beneficial for Putin that everyone thinks that they're all actively engaged in this war. They're dividing up the money. And many other things that are extremely important and significant for the world as a whole, for citizens, are actually quite secondary for Putin and for all this gang. That's why I'm convinced that they leaked this information themselves. I'm absolutely certain of it. I'm convinced that it's beneficial for them to leak this information to show Putin's importance, that issues are being decided in the Kremlin and that Trump is a puppet of the Kremlin. Right now, it's very important for Putin to show people like Pitts, Orban, and everyone else just how cool he is.
All right, fine. And what do you think about the whole story that all this correspondence and these conversations, or rather, took place via WhatsApp? First of all, it's a messenger that's banned in Russia, and this has already been acknowledged, including by Ushakov. Yes, because they used WhatsApp, that's why this wiretapping was done. And it did take place. Please tell me, what do you think about this?
Ushakov was given the order to leak the conversation with Whitcoff, to talk about this, about that, about this. He spoke quite reservedly, if you noticed. He kept calling Whitcoff my friend and so on and so forth. So this was done deliberately, you see. That's it. And in this situation, Whitcoff was essentially a hostage. That is, the conversation was being recorded. For some reason, he doesn't realize this, even though you should always be aware of that. They used to conduct negotiations over ZAS, a secure line, but suddenly decided to talk over WhatsApp. Why would they do that? Because they needed to somehow legitimize this information. How else could you legitimize it? If it's a ZAS secure line, then Whitcoff asks his communications officers, did we somehow miss this information somewhere? They say, no, nothing was missed. Everything was encrypted. So it must have been the Russians who did it. The suspicion here is that Ushakov is so surprised. Yes, someone who stole the pain is the one shouting, stop thief. That's exactly why he did it. That's why he talked over WhatsApp, so that a leak could be allowed. I even honestly doubt it. It's like an open...
All right, look, right now, Whitcoff is supposed to fly to meet with Putin, and the US Secretary of Defense is flying to Kiev to discuss something with Zelensky. Tell me, how can anyone even discuss something right now that doesn't actually exist? Because this is Putin's plan, and as such, this plan doesn't really exist. Neither Europe nor Ukraine will accept it. And most importantly, everyone already knows about this. What will come out of these meetings? Will they even take place at all?
But we don't know what they'll bring, what documents they'll bring to Zelensky and show him. Maybe they'll show him something that will make him say he'll sign anything. Well, as I said, you need to know...
Personally. Wait, but stop. Vyacheslav, it's important to understand here. Yes, Zelensky can sign anything. The question is that Ukrainian society will not accept these things that have been spoken out loud. And everyone knows this. Right now inside Ukraine, every single word of Zelensky's, they are trying to spin it in such a way that Zelensky is under pressure, so he has no right to make any decisions for his own theoretical benefit. So this approach won't work here. You understand?
How will it not work? He is the president of Ukraine. If he signs the relevant document, ceasefire, end of the war, whatever it may be, document stating that the most
important... Vyacheslav, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but maybe you've forgotten what's happening in our parliament. Right now, our parliament is demanding a complete reset of the administration. Our parliament is saying, give us more authority. Nothing that you've mentioned will be ratified by parliament. Absolutely not. They won't sign it? So, well, Zelensky will sign it, but then what?
Well, I don't want to say anything about Ukraine so that later everyone doesn't blame me for everything. But if I were in Zelensky's place and I had to sign this agreement, believe me, I would know how to do it and how to make sure that Parliament couldn't do anything about it. You see, that's why it's absolutely clear here that if there is appropriate pressure and the other side gives in somehow, then first of all, a ceasefire agreement will be signed, and secondly, elections will be scheduled in 100 days. And that's all Putin really needs, for the elections to be only in 100 days. That's very good for him because he will be able to influence these elections and influence them very seriously. Plus, there will be some other points as well. Honestly, I'll tell you, if I were in his place, I wouldn't hold on to anything except the elections. Why? Because it's clear that with the help of the Americans, there will be such a commotion that neither Zelensky nor anyone else will even be able to participate in the next elections. Yes, if the relevant corruption documents come out. Right now in America, I was just reading their website, so to speak. They're accusing the Ukrainian government of not being able to account for where 48 billion disappeared, the ministry. The Ministry of Finance in general isn't stating this directly, but is also making certain leaks saying that the money has been found in various accounts and so on. So the situation is very serious, the pressure is very serious, and the White House led by Trump is not on Ukraine's side, not on Zelensky's side, and we shouldn't discount the fact that the United States, although no longer the leader of the entire world, still remains a strong power.
I need to clarify. Look, the White House may not be on Zelensky's side 300 times over. Trump may want to end the war by any means just to forget about this problem. The Russian Foreign Ministry says that the US peace initiatives are a good thing, but there is no intention right now to make any concessions on Ukraine. That's what they're saying there. But what do concessions mean? In other words, they want the troops withdrawn from the Donetsk region, which the Russians still haven't captured. So again, what kind of concessions are we talking about? Or more precisely, what if Zelensky signed something with Trump, but they forgot to warn Putin about it? He says, no, the war will continue.
What they say in Russia, you can basically ignore altogether. Because today they say one thing, tomorrow another, and they're thinking something else entirely. Putin promised there would be no pension reform, that he wouldn't change the constitution. He promised a lot of things. So if that's how it is at the very top, no one has ever kept their word even once. Putin promised that under no circumstances would he attack Ukraine. If you remember, shortly before the invasion, he was saying that those who claimed he would attack were just spreading provocations. That's why you can never really take such statements seriously at all. But it's actually important to understand that if they wrote these 28 points and sent them to Trump, it indeed means they're somewhat interested. On the other hand, by leaking this information and everything else, they're also stirring things up and buying themselves some additional time. So, of course, as you might expect, the situation in Ukraine has become very tense right now, extremely tense, in fact, especially when it comes to the ceasefire, the ongoing peace agreements, negotiations, and so on. This entire situation is very interesting and significant to President Putin. In fact, at this particular moment, he is receiving support from all sides and various directions. China, for example, is helping him, at least in a political sense, providing diplomatic backing and support. They are expressing supposedly an interest in talking with Trump about ending the war in Ukraine, although it's clear that China needs this war more than anyone. Trump also seems to be in favor of a ceasefire. So the main players in all global processes, China and the United States, are on Putin's side. What more could you want? Who else do you need to break down, so to speak, the walls? It's clear that the people in Ukraine will be very dissatisfied, but I think that even there, those who are considering all these issues are coming from exactly this perspective. They say, well, that's how it turned out, so let's elect others in the elections who will immediately change everything. And in the elections, they will be elected. Putin's people, the fact that there will be a lot of money involved, right now, that's exactly the kind of bait being offered. In other words, these ones can't handle it, those ones can't handle it, so let's just go for it, win the elections decisively, and they will win.
I hope this doesn't happen. What else can I say? Thank you very much. Vyacheslav Maltsev was on the air on Ukraine Today. Thank you for your analysis. He is the chairman of the National Committee for the fight against Putin. All the best, Vyacheslav. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.